He thought it was just another guest, until her voice broke, and a message from her late grandfather brought Steve Harvey to tears, on live TV. What did she say that struck him so deep he couldn't speak? It was supposed to be just another Tuesday episode of Steve, filled with the usual blend of hearty laughter, pointed jokes, and the kind of wisdom that only a man who's been through fire can deliver with a grin. The lights beamed down warm and confident, the studio band played a familiar upbeat rhythm, and Steve Harvey, ever the charismatic anchor of the moment, strode out in a crisp, tailored suit with the weight of years and lessons in his walk. His voice had that unmistakable rasp, one seasoned by hard roads, humble beginnings, and a deep, abiding respect for dignity, especially in a world that doesn't always hand it to you. The crowd, mostly middle-aged and older, clapped and cheered, like they always did, not just because he was funny, but because he was real. A man who'd fallen, gotten back up, and kept talking straight. The guest lineup was standard for the show, some rising talent, a musical performance, a moment of inspiration. But there was one name in particular that caught a few off guard. Karoline Leavitt. Young, poised, confident, sharp as a tack, and the kind of person who didn't back down easily. At just 20-something, she had already made a name for herself in the political commentary world, a sphere where voices often rise fast, and fall even faster if they say the wrong thing. But Karoline wasn't just there to talk politics. Steve had invited her for a segment called Bridging the Gap, meant to explore how different generations view leadership, character, and the future of this country. What neither Steve nor the audience knew was that this conversation would turn into something far deeper than generational discourse. It would become a reckoning, a moment of profound human truth that neither cue cards nor commercial breaks could prepare anyone for. The cameras panned to her as she walked onto the stage. She wore a navy blue blazer and carried herself with the kind of posture you only get when someone raised you to believe in your own worth. She shook Steve's hand firmly, smiled with genuine warmth, and took her seat beside him. At first, the conversation danced lightly, with Steve making clever quips about technology gaps and old-school parenting, and Karoline volleying back with charm and cleverness. But then Steve, who's never shied away from getting real, leaned in just a little and asked her a question that shifted everything. "With all the noise out there," he said slowly, "what keeps you steady, Karoline? What keeps your feet on the ground?" She paused, and for the first time, something changed in her face. Her smile faded, not in discomfort, but in reverence. She looked down for a second, collected herself, then met Steve's eyes with a look that made every man in that room sit up a little straighter. "My grandfather," she said, her voice calm but thick with something unspoken. "He was a Navy vet, raised me after my dad left. He taught me what real strength looks like, and that it has nothing to do with how loud you are." The studio got quieter, the kind of quiet that feels like church. You could see Steve registering something deeper, something familiar. Maybe it was because he too had been raised by a generation of men who believed in respect more than recognition, who said more with their silence than others did, with a full page of shouting. Karoline went on, her voice steadier now but touched by emotion. "He believed in doing right even when no one's watching. And before he passed last year, he left me a message, one I haven't shared publicly before." That's when the tension in the room shifted from interest to awe. She reached into her bag slowly, pulled out her phone, and stared at it for a long second before pressing play. The voice that came out was old, gravelly, and unmistakably proud. "Karoline," it said, "if you're listening, I want you to remember one thing. This world will try to take your truth and turn it into something it can use. Don't let them. Your name, your word, your integrity, that's your legacy. And it's worth more than any title they give you." At that moment, something cracked in Steve's expression. It was subtle at first, just the softening of the eyes, the quick swipe of a hand across his face. But then the tears came. Not for show, not for TV, but because that voice, Karoline's grandfather, wasn't just talking to her. He was talking to every man who had ever tried to live right in a world that rewards the opposite. Steve didn't try to speak. He just sat there, visibly moved, nodding slowly as if he was hearing his own past speaking back to him. And that's what made the moment so powerful, because it wasn't about politics or media or age. It was about respect, about the kind of values too many men feel are slipping away. It was about a man's word, his legacy, the silent strength of doing the right thing when no one's clapping for you. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like the world is forgetting the values you built your life on, justice, dignity, standing tall even when it costs you something, then this is the kind of story you don't want to miss. We tell these stories because they matter, because your story matters. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Not for the algorithms, not for the numbers, but because we're building something real here. Something that honors the life, lessons, the battles fought quietly, and the truths worth remembering. There's more to come, and I promise, it's the kind of truth that doesn't fade. But just as the room settled, and the emotion hung in the air like incense, Karoline looked at Steve and said something no one expected. Something that made the audience gasp and made Steve's jaw go still. "He asked me to give you this, the day I knew you were ready to hear it." Karoline's voice had barely settled when Steve leaned in, sensing something deeper behind her words, something unspoken and heavy, the kind of truth that doesn't come out unless someone truly asks for it. "Tell me about him," he said, not as a TV host fishing for ratings, but as a man who knew the weight of legacy and the pain of silence. The studio was still. Karoline took a moment, swallowed hard, and then began to speak, not with political polish, not with the confidence of a commentator, but like a granddaughter reaching back in time to hold on to a man who had shaped her world. "My grandfather's name was Raymond Leavitt, grew up in a small New Hampshire town, fought in Vietnam before he was old enough to legally drink, came back home to a country that didn't care what he saw or what he lost over there." Her voice began to waver, not out of weakness but from the emotional freight she was carrying. "He never talked about the war much except to say one thing. Men don't come back from places like that the same, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't still be treated with the same respect." Steve nodded slowly, a deep crease forming in his brow. He knew exactly what kind of pain that sentence held. Karoline went on. "He worked as a mechanic for nearly 4 decades, woke up at 4:30 every morning, never took a sick day unless he physically couldn't stand, raised me after my father, left when I was 10, no questions, no complaints, just love and high expectations." Steve, visibly moved, looked out at the audience for a moment as if trying to collect himself, but the story wasn't about to let anyone breathe easy. "What most people don't know," Karoline continued, "is what he went through those last few years. He'd been trying to get full VA benefits for years. He had shrapnel in his leg, nerve damage, hearing loss, and they kept delaying his case, losing paperwork, making him jump through hoops." The crowd murmured softly, a low rumble of recognition. This wasn't news to them. Many had walked similar roads or knew someone who had. "At one point," she said, "he got a letter that called his injuries non-service connected. After everything he gave, they tried to tell him it wasn't enough, that he didn't qualify." Her voice sharpened with hurt now, and Steve leaned back in his chair, visibly unsettled. "He sat in that kitchen," she said, "with that letter in his hand, stared at it for a long time, and finally said, 'So this is how they thank us? We come home broken and they try to forget we were ever there.'" The studio was silent again, but not the peaceful kind. This was the silence of hearts breaking in unison. "He didn't want pity," Karoline said, "just dignity. He believed in accountability, in fairness. He believed that if a man gave his body to this country, the least it could do was treat him like he mattered." At that moment, Steve's expression shifted. His smile was gone, his eyes burning with something deeper. And Karoline wasn't finished. He started writing letters, dozens of them, to senators, representatives, VA offices. I watched him sit at that table, hands shaking from arthritis, writing the same words over and over. "I served this country. I didn't dodge it. I didn't run from it. I gave it my all. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to be seen." Her voice cracked. They never responded. Not once. A low gasp from the crowd underscored the weight of it. Steve sat frozen, lips parted, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. And then Karoline looked, directly at him, her eyes shining not just with sorrow but fire. In the last months of his life, we had to sell his truck to pay for his prescriptions. The man who taught me to stand on principle had to give up the last thing he owned outright, just to stay alive another week. The air in the room tightened, as if it had shrunk in on itself. No camera angle could capture the rawness of that moment. This wasn't just a touching personal story. This was a quiet indictment. A revelation of how systems built on promises can fail the very people who gave everything to uphold them. And even then, Karoline whispered, he never lost his belief in this country. He told me, "Don't give up on it, Karoline. Just help fix it." Steve finally spoke, but his voice was rough, like it had to climb over a mountain of pain to get out. "That's not just a story," he said. "That's a truth a lot of us have lived." The audience responded with a solemn round of applause, not loud, not celebratory, but steady, respectful. The kind of applause given not to a performance, but to a man they wished they'd met. And then, just as the room began to settle into the weight of what had been said, Karoline reached into her coat pocket, her hand shaking slightly, and pulled out a folded piece of lined notebook paper. "This," she said, "was the last letter he ever wrote before he passed. He never mailed it. He left it in an envelope addressed to you, Steve." Steve froze. His lips parted, his brows drew tight, and he sat up straight. "To me?" he asked quietly. Karoline nodded, then placed the letter gently in his hands. "He always watched your show. He said you reminded him of the kind of man who doesn't forget where he came from, and that if anyone could carry this message forward, it was you." Steve looked down at the envelope, hands trembling, eyes blinking rapidly as the audience held their collective breath. But as he opened it, unfolded the letter with care, and read the first few lines silently, his face changed. And then, for the first time in his entire career, Steve Harvey couldn't go on. He stood up, gently placed the letter on his chair, and walked off stage with tears rolling down his cheeks, because the very first line of the letter said, "To the man I never met, but always trusted with my story." But that tender moment of shared grief and admiration, of a grandfather's enduring voice echoing through a studio filled with strangers who suddenly felt like family, was followed by something no one in the room saw coming. As the last words of Raymond Leavitt's message faded into silence, Karoline looked up with a calm that didn't match the storm in her eyes. "What I didn't mention," she said, her voice now steadier, colder almost, "was what happened after he died." Steve leaned forward, brow furrowed, sensing the shift. "We buried him in a plot he chose himself, right next to his brother, also a veteran. We paid for everything out of pocket. No help, no assistance, because by the time the VA finally approved his benefits, he was already gone. The check came 2 weeks after his funeral, addressed to him, not us, and labeled non-transferable." Murmurs of disbelief rose from the audience, and Steve muttered under his breath, "Lord, have mercy." But Karoline wasn't finished. "That was only the beginning," she said, voice tightening. "I thought that was the last injustice, but I was wrong. About a month after his death, I got a call from the town zoning board. They told me there was an issue with his headstone. Said it didn't meet some new regulation. Too tall, not in line with updated aesthetic standards." Steve blinked in confusion. "They wanted you to move his headstone?" "No," she said bitterly. "They wanted me to replace it. Said it wasn't uniform with community expectations. I asked them if they knew he was a decorated veteran. They said the rules applied to everyone." Her voice quivered again, but it was anger now, not grief. "That headstone had his Navy emblem, his rank, and the words he always said to me, 'Stand with honor.' I carved it in myself, paid extra for it, because it mattered to him. And they said it wasn't good enough." Steve clenched his jaw. The camera panned briefly to men in the audience shaking their heads in disbelief, one wiping a tear. "Did you fight it?" he asked. "Of course I did," Karoline replied. "I went to the town hall, brought photos, letters, even his military discharge papers. I explained who he was, what he'd done. But it didn't matter. The woman behind the desk told me, and I'll never forget this, we can't make exceptions, even for someone who served. Otherwise, we'd have chaos. Chaos, she repeated, her voice bitter, as if honoring a man like that was somehow disruptive. Steve exhaled slowly, eyes narrowed in pain. That's the problem, he said quietly. We got people following rules with no sense of right. Karoline nodded. It got worse. A few days later, I drove out to the cemetery to see the headstone, just to feel close to him, and it was gone. They didn't call me, they didn't warn me, they'd come in the night and removed it. The audience gasped audibly. Steve sat back, stunned, hand over his mouth. What did they do with it? He asked after a beat. Karoline blinked. They left it in the maintenance shed, covered in a tarp like it was garbage. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair, knuckles white. I found it on a concrete floor, scratched, chipped. The engraving was cracked right through the word honor. The room sat in stunned silence. I stood there, she said quietly, in that cold shed, staring down at the last thing my grandfather ever asked for. And I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. All I could think was, how do you tell a man who gave everything that in the end, he meant nothing to the people who make the rules? Steve didn't speak. Couldn't. The audience wasn't clapping. They weren't cheering. They were still, processing the kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than any one moment. I tried to fight, Karoline continued. I got a lawyer. We appealed to the mayor. We spoke at council meetings. And everywhere I went, people nodded their heads, said they were sorry, said they understood. But nothing changed. Because no one wanted to go on record saying a soldier mattered more than a landscaping bylaw. She laughed bitterly, one short breath of disbelief. I even got hate mail, she added. Anonymous letters saying I was exploiting my grandfather's death for attention, that I should let it go and stop making people uncomfortable. Steve finally leaned in again. What did you do? Karoline looked straight into the camera, her voice steady but hollow. I went back to that maintenance shed. I picked up that headstone myself, and I drove it home. I keep it in my garage now, covered with an American flag. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Because this country wasn't willing to give him the space to rest in peace, I had to take him back. The audience sat frozen, not with shock, now, but with the weight of knowing the story wasn't rare. It was real. It was their story, or their father's, or their neighbor's. Steve looked like he was trying not to cry again, but he couldn't hold it. That's not just a wrong, he said softly. That's a wound on all of us. Karoline looked at him, then back out to the crowd. We talk about freedom, about sacrifice, but we don't talk about what it means to be forgotten after. The sacrifice is made. My grandfather fought so people could speak freely. But when I speak now, people call me divisive. He fought so I could live with pride. But when I defend his legacy, I get told I'm being dramatic. She paused. So, if it's dramatic to want justice, then fine. I'll be dramatic, because I won't let silence bury him a second time. The crowd erupted into slow, emotional applause, not out of entertainment, but solidarity. Steve sat still, overcome. Then he turned to her and asked, if he were here now, what would you want to say to him? And Karoline, without hesitation, whispered, I'm sorry I couldn't protect your dignity the way you protected mine. And in that moment, across thousands of homes and hearts watching from couches and kitchen tables, a collective breath was held. Not just for Raymond Leavitt, but for every man who'd given everything and still been treated like he was disposable. And then Karoline added almost inaudibly, and the worst part? The worst part is, I found out later the order to remove the headstone came from someone who knew he was a veteran. They just didn't care. Steve sat quietly, still holding Karoline's hand, and in that moment, the studio wasn't a set. It felt more like a chapel, hushed and reverent, where truth had just been spoken and no one dared break its echo. The pain, the injustice, the weight of what Karoline had carried alone. It had finally been shared, and not just by Steve, but by the hearts of every man and woman sitting in that audience and watching from home, especially those who knew what it felt like to be told that their sacrifice, or the sacrifice of someone they loved, had an expiration date in the eyes of bureaucracy. Steve leaned in, his voice raw but steady now, and said, "You came here with more than a message. You came here with a mission, and I think it's time we do something about it." The crowd murmured in agreement, a low hum of awakening. Steve turned to his producer just off camera and gave a nod, the kind that doesn't need words to be understood. "We're not letting this go," he said, now to everyone in the room. "We're gonna help fix this." Karoline, still processing what had just happened, blinked at him, unsure whether to hope again. And then Steve turned back to her and said, "I want to take this story national. We'll start right here, right now. But we're going to call the town, the board, the mayor, whoever we have to. I'll put my name on it, and I've got a few friends who will too. People need to see what happens when they dishonor someone like your grandfather, and they need to understand that silence is no longer an option." For the first time since the headstone was taken, Karoline felt something rise in her chest that had been buried too long, righteous hope. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a movement. That very night, after the taping, the segment was clipped and uploaded to Steve's official channels. Within hours, it began spreading, fast. Veterans groups shared it, military families shared it. Men who hadn't spoken publicly about their pain in years found themselves commenting, sharing, writing letters. Hashtags like Sakon Honor Raymond and I'm Stand With Honor began trending. And by morning, the mayor's office had received over 20,000 emails. Not spam, not bots. Real people, real stories, real outrage. But it wasn't just digital noise. It was the kind of outcry rooted in lived experience, the kind that makes officials sit up straight in their chairs and wonder what storm they've just walked into. Karoline, stunned by the momentum, received a call the next day from the very zoning commissioner who'd dismissed her months ago. "Miss Leavitt," the voice said, much meeker than before. We'd like to discuss a possible resolution." But Karoline wasn't in the mood for vague language anymore. "A resolution?" she asked, voice calm but firm. "Or a correction?" There was a pause. Then, "We're looking into reinstating the headstone and issuing a formal apology, possibly even a commendation." Karoline didn't answer right away. She let the silence do the talking, and after a beat she said, "You had your chance to do this when no one was looking. Now you'll do it while everyone's watching." Later that week, Steve invited her back, this time not to tell a story, but to witness what happens when good people refuse to stay quiet. In a special follow-up segment, veterans from across the country joined the audience. Some wore their uniforms, others brought photos of loved ones. One older man in his 80s stood up and said, "They moved my brother's marker too. I never had the strength to fight it, but today I do." The room applauded, not for spectacle, but for shared healing. Steve then turned to the screen behind them, where a live feed showed town officials, including the mayor, standing at the cemetery. They'd agreed to reinstall Raymond's original headstone right where it had been, this time with full honors. The screen cut to a bagpiper playing Amazing Grace as workers gently placed the stone, this time surrounded by an honor guard of local veterans who had volunteered to stand watch. It wasn't just a moment of redemption. It was a declaration that dignity does not expire. And then, just when it seemed the moment couldn't be more powerful, Steve looked back at Karoline and said, "There's someone else who wanted to say something." The lights dimmed slightly, and the studio screen lit up with a video message. It was from a U.S. senator, a veteran himself, who said, "What happened to Raymond Leavitt should never have happened. And because of your courage, Miss Leavitt, I'm introducing a new bill, the Raymond Leavitt Veterans Rest Act. It'll ensure that no city or town can remove or alter a veteran's resting place without family consent, ever again." The audience erupted, not just in applause but in relief. Real change, not just for one man, but for every man and woman who served and every family who carries the weight of their service. Karoline stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed, and then she cried. Not in grief this time, but in gratitude. She turned to Steve, voice cracking again, but with joy this time. He's finally home. Not just in the ground, but in the story, in the legacy, in the law. And as the audience rose to its feet, clapping not out of habit but out of deep respect, one older man in the front row whispered to the person next to him, "This is what justice looks like." And yet, just as the cameras began to pan out, Steve got another call in his earpiece, one that made his brow furrow and his smile fade. He stood, gently placed his hand on Karoline's shoulder and said, "You're not going to believe this, but there's more." The call Steve received in his earpiece that day wasn't from a producer or a staff member. It was from the very heart of the movement that had started in that studio, a quiet storm gaining strength far beyond the reach of cameras. The voice on the line belonged to a retired colonel who had seen the segment online and felt compelled to act. "Mr. Harvey," he said, firm but emotional, "I've worked my whole life trying to protect the dignity of our service members. I've never seen something cut through the noise like this. I want to help." What followed was an extraordinary chain of events that even Steve, a man used to big surprises and larger-than-life moments, found hard to process. Over the next few weeks, Karoline and Steve were invited to Washington, D.C., not for a publicity stunt, but for a quiet meeting behind closed doors where lawmakers, veterans, and Gold Star families gathered to share stories that had long been buried in silence. One widow spoke about her husband's unmarked grave that had been paved over in a land dispute. A father told of a forgotten cemetery where weeds had overtaken the stones of fallen soldiers. These weren't just stories, they were scars. And together, they gave voice to the thousands who had been forgotten. In the center of it all stood Karoline, young, grieving, but unshakably grounded. She didn't come to speak for attention. She came to honor the kind of man who had once knelt beside her as a little girl and taught her how to plant a flag into soft earth, explaining, "This isn't just a grave, sweetheart. This is a promise kept." When the bill honoring her grandfather finally passed, the applause in the chamber wasn't thunderous. It was solemn, like the lowering of a flag. A small ceremony followed. No cameras, no podiums, just a folded flag, handed to Karoline by the colonel who had made that first call. "For your grandfather," he said, voice low and reverent, "and for all the ones like him." Back in the studio, Steve sat alone one evening, watching the footage again. Not the flashy clips, but the quiet ones. The pause before Karoline spoke. The look in her eyes. The sound of her grandfather's voice echoing into a world that had nearly forgotten him. And Steve thought of his mama, of her strength, of how she used to tell him, "The truth don't shout, baby. It just stands." He felt the weight of what had happened, not as a host, not even as a man in the public eye, but as a son, as a citizen, as someone who still believed that dignity, once taken, must always be restored. Karoline went on to speak at several veterans events, not as a politician or a rising star, but as a granddaughter on a mission. Every time she told her story, she would pull out her phone, play that old message, and watch the faces in the crowd shift. Some stoic, some in tears, but all listening, all. One elderly vet came up to her after a speech, tears tracking down a weathered face. He took her hand and said, "You brought my brother home too. I didn't even know I needed that until I heard you." And that's what this became. Not just about a headstone, but about remembering who we are. In a world that often moves too fast, too loud, and too carelessly, Karoline's story slowed people down, made them listen, made them feel, made them remember that honor isn't something we give, it's something we guard. One evening, long after the noise had died down and the internet had moved on, Karoline visited her grandfather's grave. The stone was back in its rightful place, this time with a small plaque beneath it, quietly added by the town, restored by the voices of many, in honor of one. She knelt down, placed a single white rose at the base and whispered, "We did it, Grandpa. No crowds, no applause. Just wind through the trees and the quiet certainty that dignity, once restored, doesn't need to shout. It simply stands." If this story moved you, even just for a moment, then maybe it reminded you of something bigger than all of us, that dignity doesn't fade with time, it only waits to be remembered. And sometimes, the quietest voices carry the deepest truth. If you believe in honoring that truth, in standing up for what's right even when no one's watching, then this channel is for you. So if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts or a memory of someone who inspired your values. Your voice matters here, because stories like this aren't just told, they're passed down.